Lace Watkins of Lace on Race. This is a hot take in a hot room, which means it's going to be a short one. If you saw the title, you saw what this is about. Queen Elizabeth has passed. What does this have to do with race? Pretty much everything. Pretty much everything. I'm going to leave it to others to talk about the Queen's legacy, for good, for ill. Do I have opinions? I have. But that's not why I'm coming to you today. Of course, I wish her Godspeed. And as an former Anglican, and she was the putative head of our church, I feel it in something of a visceral way. But I want to talk more, not about her passing, but about coverage of her passing. At Lace on Race, we take slightly different angles, which is why there will be lots and lots of places that will talk about things that pretty much everyone else is going to talk about. I want to focus on a phrase that I have read over and over and over this morning, and that is post-colonialism. How Queen Elizabeth reigned during a post-colonial time. To use an expression that my British friends often use, that's bollocks. Just like there is no such thing as living in a post-racial world or a post-racial society, there is also no such thing as a post-colonial world or a post-colonial society. Those who disagree with me will talk about the fact that most of the countries and territories and colonies that stretched to the ends of the globe during Britain's heyday are no more. They are now independent countries, and the reach and influence are no more. I heartily disagree. A lot of these independence movements, wonderful as they were, and I applaud and affirm every single one of them, are a matter of degree. It really is hot. Are a matter of degree. And that needs to be talked about. In countries like the United States, where white people hold a majority, it's easier to look at the influence and reach of people who are in the majority. That is less true in most other places that Britain colonized, with the exceptions of Canada, so yeah, North America, and also Australia and New Zealand. But in other places where their official role may have ended, their influence remains. Certainly, the social and economic capital remains, for the most part, in the hands of white people. This needs to be remembered, and also, dare I add, land. As I looked at the various images of Queen Elizabeth over this past morning, what I was struck by was the fact that she dripped with jewels in countries not of her own. Great Britain is what it is, and was the power that it was because of systematic rape. That does not mean that I do not mourn the Queen. I do. But I am mourning the Queen as I am going to mourn my mother this weekend. And I'm going to ask that you stay with me as I make this comparison. I love and loved Bobby Jean. She was a complicated woman who cannot possibly exist within binaries. And people want so much to revert to the comfort of the binary when they think of those who died. Either they were all good or all evil. The fact is usually somewhere in the middle. And Queen Elizabeth needs to be looked at as her own person, but also as the ostensible and putative head of a nation that still has its fingers in a lot of pies and that has had undeniable influence. That nuance is going to be difficult for the mainstream media to parse. For one thing, they're not doing a good job of it themselves, so there's no way that they're going to do a particularly good job of conveying nuance and, yes, dissonance and incongruence to the people they write to and for. This is important to remember. We are going to know of the Queen, and by extension, the history of the last 70 years of her reign as something that people are going to decide what pieces, parts we should know. This is where a agnostic sort of skepticism, and that's something we should have for most mainstream media, an agnostic, for some more or less generous form of skepticism. I need to remember, and I need to invite you all to remember, that what I am going to be consuming in media is going to be a partial story. A story with an angle, a story with a hook, a story with an agenda. And I need to hold that in my mind as I pivot to what happens next. The way the monarchy is structured these days, the monarchy is considered to be almost rigidly, in fact, definitely rigidly, apolitical. That no one is supposed to know the royal family's true feelings on social issues and politics, although that has changed over time. But they very rarely have led social movements and social change in both actuality and attitudinally. They have followed what the masses have done. That's true for a lot of public figures. Very rarely do they take leadership positions. And when I think of the most obvious, I think of Meghan Markle. Could the Queen have been more supportive? Could the Queen have been more vocal in that support? I think she could have. I think she could have used her status and her influence and her massive social capital to usher in a new era. A lot of times, and this is a broader thing, a lot of times Europeans are thought of as more progressive than their American counterparts, and Europeans like to think of themselves as more progressive than their unwashed cousins across the pond. But are they? When we really drill down, are their attitudes any better? Is their behavior any better? Are the myths any more truer than the myths Americans tell ourselves? Again, there is a risk here for me in talking about the broader themes as well as some of the dichotomies and some of the reservations that I have with Queen Elizabeth herself. But those have to be held in hand. There are some who are saying it is almost a slam dunk that there will be an even more rightward lurch in Great Britain than we have seen since Thatcher. That's probably true. Even when one has to take a sort of disingenuous kind of neutrality, well, if it's true for us, it's also true for the crown. There is no such thing as neutrality. Neutrality always benefits the oppressor, not the oppressed. The status quo, what is more gently called tradition, buttresses and holds up a system which is, while at least ostensibly, superficially weakened, still holds sway. Again, there are some who thinks that Queen Elizabeth held the tide against some of the worst excesses of rightward drift, and that includes race. It is impossible to say with certainty whether or not that's true mere hours after the monarch's death. But people will, now that the era of Queen Elizabeth is over, hopefully will be able to take accurate, factual, even generous, but actual and factual measure of her scope and of her influence, because that scope and influence is absolutely going to inform and even drive what happens. Will her legacy, for good or ill, continue? Will there be an abrupt left or right turn? Only time will tell. But I do think that this does mark the end of a very particular era. I am still waiting for the day when a non-white person can aspire to ascend to the highest echelons of politics and public service in Great Britain and the EU, and even enter into the royal families of Europe. That's also instructive. Buckingham Palace made it a point to remind everyone in very stark terms that Meghan Markle would never hold the title of princess. Now, to some that seems superficial as what brand of contour that I use. But I have to say, it is not superficial. Insofar as people from across the pond like to talk about our lack of progress, our slow progress, our incomplete progress, they would do well to look at how it's been done in the various countries of the EU and of Great Britain itself. So long as there is not full, and I do mean full, integration and inclusion within the EU and of Great Britain, people of color, the ex-colonizer, perhaps this is where air quotes are warranted, the ex-colonized will always be grafted onto, will always be considered one step or more below And even those countries who swear they don't have a problem with black people often have a problem with Middle Eastern Arab people, and they just substitute one marginalized class for another. All of this needs to be looked at, and now in the post Queen Elizabeth age. Perhaps these conversations can happen across the pond. And much in the same way that it needs to be remembered that South Africa couldn't have been South Africa without Jim Crow. America is not America without the excesses of Britain and the rest of Europe. In order to have authentic and truth-telling and congruent conversations about that entire continent, those questions, and even better questions, need to be asked and not answered flippantly nor answered too quickly, but answered with intention and with credulity. It is a big deal this day. There is sadness, to be sure. There is also discombobulation and uncertainty. I know how I hope Great Britain, and by extension Europe, will walk through this new era.